John Bambenek, thanks for joining us on the Illinois channel, and you are joining us from Strasbourg, France, the first international video recording we've done, and we thank you for joining us while you're on a business trip over there. And for those who don't know, let me introduce you very briefly that you are an expert, and obviously by the fact that you are over in Strasbourg, I should have said a security expert, by the virtue of the fact that you are over in Strasbourg, an international security expert. Just give us a thumbnail sketch very briefly of your own background so people know why we are talking to you.
Sure. I've been doing cybersecurity for 20 years, a lot of investigation most of that time. I was very active in the 2016 election cycle for the various election-related hacking that was going on and disinformation. I do a lot of digital surveillance on cybercrime, occasionally threats other countries pose upon the United States and our interests, and finishing my PhD in a cybersecurity-related discipline here at the University of Illinois.
And John, we're going to be talking about both international and personal security. You know, a lot of people worry about their personal information, but I want to start with more the international threat and what's going on in people. I think an underreported story that's going on right now is the whole development of technology that everyone knows about, keeps changing. One of the big developments that's coming at us is what's called 5G, and that's the fifth generation of cell phone. And you know, just we're using 4Gs now with our phones. But the problem is, as I understand it, that 5G, while it can do amazing things and will greatly enhance our broadband connection, all the connections gear right now is made by the Chinese telecom giant Huawei. Give us a background as to what's going on. The president is concerned about that. Tell us what you know about Huawei and why we should be concerned about it.
Sure. I mean, Huawei is a large telecommunications provider of equipment and has been for some time. And their controversy has not been new. As a Chinese firm, where there's been allegations that they get illegal subsidies that artificially deflate the cost of their equipment so that they can unfairly compete against American companies. There's concerns about espionage, where from time to time other governments, and not traditionally just the U.S. aligned countries, have accused Huawei of aiding espionage. And certainly the concerns that a Chinese company and some of the connections that they've had and where they've come from has raised some red flags as well, that we could be adopting technology that leads to a greater espionage risk to not just our government leaders, but our business leaders, our intellectual property, and private individuals.
You know, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there was even some concern about some of the rail cars that were going to be updated in Chicago because they were made by a Chinese firm, and people want to have wireless connections on their laptops on the rail cars. And then the security was, you know, we have any number of people that the fear was their business could be compromised by the Chinese just from that. Is this a legitimate kind of threat, and not maybe specifically just that, but just in a broader context? To what extent are these legitimate threats that we have to be concerned about, and to what extent are people maybe becoming paranoid?
Well, they are legitimate threats. One of the threats that I'm tracking right now is allegedly Chinese state-sponsored surveillance of Uyghur Muslims inside and outside of China via exploits of mobile and Android phones. So certainly these kind of things happen, and they certainly exist. And China has traditionally casted a very wide net in terms of who they surveil and how they surveil them. And certainly when you think of business travelers and people who go to the airport, that's a subset of people who may have interesting information. And certainly under President Obama, we got an agreement that China would stop stealing our company's intellectual property for commercial gain. That agreement apparently is no longer in force. So certainly that risk has returned.
And as we talk about Huawei, the president has not wanted to have both the United States or our NATO allies. You're over, I don't know if you can even say who you're talking to, but you're over in Europe, and obviously NATO is our security partners in Europe. They, I think, want to reach out. The Europeans, am I right, that they want to use the Huawei technology, but the president is saying, we don't want you to be using that because then that compromises U.S. national security secrets as well.
Well, no, I think that's very much the case. I mean, there's two elements of it, right? There's the anti-competitive practices that Huawei benefits from, and then obviously the espionage risk that, via diplomatic channels we've tried to resolve with Five Eyes countries, NATO countries, and some of our more traditional allies, definitely, and certainly, insofar as we share our military strategy and assets and intelligence with those partners, if they're relying on that kind of infrastructure, then they definitely are subject to those same risks.
When we talk about spying, we all grew up with a lot of us James Bond, and we think of it as either the Russians or some evil genius out there. Is the nature of spying these days taking government secrets predominantly, or would you say it's more about taking business secrets?
Well, it's all of the above, right? With as much information that is digitized, it's become easier to steal information, right? I mean, the same kind of techniques to steal credit card information can steal secret plans or customer lists or intellectual property, patentable information, you name it. So the cost has been radically reduced, and the potential sphere of victims has radically increased. I mean, if you go back 40 years ago, if you wanted to steal confidential plans for, an automobile, right, you'd have to send somebody to Detroit to do it. Now you can do it over the internet or steal it from manufacturing plants and the like. So, much in the way there's security risk with the adoption of 5G generally, our adoption of technology has never really, it's always exceeded our analysis and dealing of the risks of adopting that. So I don't know how you really measure how much traditional national security related espionage compared to corporate espionage compared to just spying on individuals, right? There's technology out there that, your stereotypical ex-husband uses to stalk his ex-wife. And that is now technology enabled also. So it certainly risks across the spectrum, and it's very real.
Let me ask you, as you bring up the whole idea of the credit card stealing, a lot of people personally, of course, for understandable reasons, worry about their personal technology. Whether at a business level or as an individual, is it possible for people to adequately secure their information when the technology constantly is changing? And I would think as it changes, it creates new threats.
Well, I think the biggest problem with that is where the information actually resides. In the past couple of years, my credit card information has been stolen, 6 or so times. Not because it was stolen from my laptop, but it was, one was stolen from a grocery store, one was stolen from, a hotel brand. There's nothing I could have done. I just went about my life, staying in hotels, buying groceries for my family, and my credit card got compromised. There's nothing I could have or could not have done. And a lot of our information now is being stored and aggregated and collected and sold by third-party companies that maybe I have visibility to who they are, maybe I don't. And actually, in many cases, I don't, which means there's really nothing I can do about, a social media company keeping my information intact, or, a grocery store, a hotel, or you name whatever company that's out there who's keeping my information. And those are more lucrative targets because, I don't have to steal from a million people. I just have to steal from a company that a million people use.
Yeah, that's the problem that people feel. And so even though they take maybe some security from themselves, they could be stolen through their grocery store or their credit card person. We see that all the time, or department store that maybe has their information. Hopefully, is it a problem of these companies not taking security threats seriously enough, or what is the problem that we can't have better security? And to what extent do someone like yourself have the answers that you can tell these people, look, here as a company is what you can do to have better security so your customers' information isn't being ripped off?
Well, in a lot of cases, they make mistakes. There's insufficient security. Somebody had access and put information where it didn't belong. Sometimes there's sophisticated vulnerabilities that nobody was aware about. So as a security professional, I tell people it's like, at best I can give you 90%, right? And that's not really a quantitative figure; it's qualitative. I can't secure against all threats. And you take a small to medium business, they don't have $500,000 to spend on great cybersecurity. So all you can do is focus on simple and low cost things, and hope for the best. But some companies that do have more enhanced security requirements, hospitals, healthcare, critical utilities, certainly do need to be worried about this also. But there's a lot of simple things that those entities can do and start with. Always making sure you're installing updates, having strong passwords, being careful of what you click on in email. A lot of the way malware gets from point A to point B involves tricking somebody to compromise themselves. So being aware of what people do, and the usual advice of having a good antivirus tool, and a firewall on your network are certainly great steps. And there's other low cost things for businesses to add as well in terms of securing DNS traffic and the like.
We see the problem is that one of the growing problems is what we call ransom. I don't, it was a, I forget, ransom threat or something, where people take control of a hospital or a business's computer systems, and until they're paid their ransom, they don't let the system go. How big of a threat? And again, is that something that it's just carelessness on the part of those being victimized, that they could have taken steps, or is this some super duper security threat that we just can't stop?
Well, there's certainly steps that people could take to protect themselves, right? And most of this malware is delivered by somebody clicking on something, somebody installing something on their network, not having backups. Some of the things that you've called best practices for 20 or 30 years, right? But there are some environments in where the availability of technology is so critical that the time for backups is too much. A hospital's a great example. We've put computers in MRI machines and the equipment doctors rely on to perform surgeries. And when you need surgery, particularly when you're talking about trauma, it needs to be available right now. Saying, hey, come back tomorrow while the system reboots isn't the right answer. So having backup plans to say, okay, this is how we're going to do what we've done without access to this stuff, is important to have. Isolating networks, right? An MRI machine doesn't need to be talking to Russian server somewhere to get ransomware. There are definite steps, but nothing is 100%. Yeah, absolutely right. There's only things that you can do that are cost effective and reasonable. If a hostile foreign government runs in with a USB thumb drive and starts installing software directly, there's only so much you can do about that.
One of the things that we hear about these days is the Internet of Things, and by that we mean, as I understand it, you correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand it, the Internet of Things is when we have the 5G technology, we'll have so much more broadband speed and bandwidth, I guess, that we'll be able to have our toasters connected to the Internet, our all these gadgets, our refrigerators, so maybe they tell us before we come home that we need to buy more milk or something. And that sounds very cool. But I sometimes wonder, are we putting the cart before the horse? Are we just setting ourselves up to have a society that can be shut down by international threats because we haven't taken the security steps first before we open up the doors to all this technology, to where we let bad guys get access into our homes, into our refrigerators, and shut us down to where it's not just a hospital being held ransom, it's our individual homes or our community at large.
No, absolutely. I mean, the Internet of Things is just taking a traditional device that you think of every day and plugging it in a computer and making it networked. So, I mean, there's treadmills, you name it, right? And a lot of these, you know, nobody's really all that interested in the features, right? You mentioned a smart refrigerator. I don't need my refrigerator to tell me when I'm out of milk. I've got a wife and 6 kids. Believe me, I know what my grocery list is when I leave work that I need to stop for. But a lot of companies are creating these not necessarily, make life a little bit more convenient, but to glean information about what we're doing, and they're not really worried about the risks. So you say a toaster connected to the internet. Most people think, oh, what's the worst that can happen? These things have filaments that heat up. You can cause fires with them. We've gone through this exercise with cars where, it took hackers operating on the right side of the law to say, hey, we can remotely take over a car and shut it off, turn on the brakes, do whatever, to say, hey, no, plugging cars into the internet over the cellular network means if you don't do that right, bad things can happen. I had a student in one of my classes who was able to compromise a smart light bulb. He's like, changed the color of the light without any real permission. Okay, that's interesting. Was able to make it blink at the right frequency to cause an epileptic seizure. Well, now we've got a real life safety risk. And many of these companies are 1, 2, 3-man shops who don't have any real experience with security. They're like, yeah, we made light bulbs, so all we did was just develop an app for it, and then never thought about it again.
Well,
In the case of that light bulb, we couldn't even report it.
As we tape this and we are approaching the anniversary of 9/11, it seems to me, in the modern terrorism era, we're making things easy because if they can compromise a car being driven, they could possibly compromise a jet and then just fly it remotely into a building. Or if we're driving into Chicago, if they just hacked 1 or 2 or 4 trucks or cars, they could drive them into each other and the accidents would paralyze a city in short order. Should we have the government say, before you can bring some technology to the marketplace, we need to have some kind of a security stamp on the product, kind of like we used to have the good housekeeping seal of approval, only have that from maybe a government agency that says, if you're going to have access to the consumer market, you have to have considered and implemented some reasonable security methodology so that these are not going to be easily hacked. Is that a good idea?
What we've noticed with regulation is that rarely solves a security problem, because in part, the companies themselves have access to the regulators. They overly influence the process. And it's hard to say, okay, what is the best practice for a secure toaster? The person who can tell you how to hack this stuff is, it takes a specific kind of mindset that you'd almost call a sociopath. Something I go through an intellectual exercise with my students, right? Think of a smart device. Now think of how you can kill somebody with that smart device. It's not a place that a normal mind goes, which means it's hard for, regulators to envision some of this stuff. Car hacking seemed fantastical until somebody actually demonstrated that it was possible. So I think some measure of regulation is possible. Certainly the FTC has a role and is looking at it, doing it as kind of retroactive enforcement of somebody breached privacy. Now they're, looking for cause or whatever. But the important thing that's in my mind, right? And, after 9/11, there's lots of talk about cyber terrorism in 2001. And I was telling people it's just not a thing. You can't kill somebody with an email, but in the almost 20 years, 18 years since 9/11, we can't keep your information secure. We can't keep your credit card, your health record secure. It's getting breached all the time. And now we're putting things on the internet that interact with the physical world. We are creating a world where cyber terrorism is possible. It's not there today. The groups that are interested in it aren't very sophisticated, and they're focusing on the wrong things, thankfully. But that's not the right way to envision national security of a society is, hey, hopefully we get lucky. So I think, providers have to have some responsibility, absolutely. But it's largely the way that even we in the public envision technology, right? When we buy something, we say we want it secure, but we buy things based off of features. Hey, I can do this neat thing. Hey, look, with my phone, I can go look, up the camera attached to my doorbell and see who's delivering the mail, right? And then realize, oh, I didn't realize that, I can get subpoenas from the government to deliver, video of potential crimes, or, my stalker ex-boyfriend can compromise the password and know when I'm coming or going. And part of it is that most normal people aren't very good at envisioning what malicious people will do because they're not malicious. I mean, that's a good thing for our society, but it makes it very hard to regulate against the threat or envision the threat.
Yeah, and you know, one thing and we're going to let you go pretty soon here, but one thing that I had talked to some people in the electric business, and we talk about the electric grid, and one of the you know, it's national security, obviously, to keep our modern society with electricity, and the grid is often just too vulnerable. And the electric executives I talk to say, you know, our number one, our expertise is how to transmit electricity, not how to be security experts. And number two, we have a military, a U.S. military that is formed to protect the nation. But when it comes to the electric grid, they act as if it's the duty of individual businesses to protect the grid. And I thought that was an interesting point, that it's a national security interest to keep the grid up. Shouldn't we have some, maybe part of the Department of Defense, working with companies, especially critical services like electricity, to make sure that we have some kind of the dollars being spent to protect the grid, because that is certainly a national security asset that we need to protect.
No, and that's a fundamental and unique problem the United States has. The overwhelming majority of our critical infrastructure is in private hands. You know, we think of the power grid, you know, in most parts of the world, it's a government-run entity. And in some places, the government runs a power company or water company or utilities. In a lot of cases, it's simply in private hands. There are programs. The Department of Homeland Security has a program of outreaching to industry. The FBI has InfraGard. But those are really intelligence sharing efforts. When the rubber meets the road, the question is who's paying the bill? And, you know, the government is, hey, you know, we're dealing with our own infrastructure. You know, why aren't you, private industry, securing the stuff that you own? And private industry is, you know, hey, our job is to keep people's, you know, power on. We're not equipped to deal with threats from far Eastern Europe or East Asia. So it is a very interesting dynamic that's pretty unique to the United States. You know, there is some spending. The University of Illinois has a great research group specifically on trustworthy and secure power grids. But it's definitely an area of tension between the public sector and the private sector, because most of the critical infrastructure is actually in the private sector's hands. And we have a culture in the United States where we don't like public subsidies for private business interests.
Before we close out, I want to say, just in case people are saying, why is the Illinois channel talking to John Bambenek from France? Well, John is very connected. You live in the Urbana area, and you have, I think, been schooled through the University of Illinois. You just recently were on the Illinois Board of Higher Education, so you're very involved in Illinois. And we typically interview you when you are in Illinois.
Yeah.
But the fact that you are, again, in Strasbourg, France tonight, and you're talking to others trying to communicate some of the very thing that we are talking about, I would guess, to other security experts, just goes to, I think, again, underscore the credentials that you bring to this subject. And we appreciate you taking the time. If before we close out, we know you've already had a long day. It's we're starting our day here, but you're ending your day there, and we want to not keep you up too much longer. Is there any last parting words you would say to people? And if not, you know, we can catch up with you at a future time.
Well, I say, you know, we talk about power grids, and there's a lot of things that individuals can't control. Certainly the policymakers need to be aware, you know, but individuals, in terms of keeping your data safe, is being aware of who has it, what they're doing with it, you know, and taking some ownership of your own privacy and your own security before you start plugging smart devices into your home. Have an understanding of how they're updated and how they're secured and how that data is being used, because there really isn't anybody out there who's going to protect your privacy if you don't take ownership of it and keep in mind of what's coming into your house and how that data is being used.
Well, John Bambenek, we appreciate you taking the time from your long day there in France. We hope you get a little time to enjoy it while you're in France. And thank you again so much for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.